Hello everyone! Oddly enough, it has become fashionable today to revise and even question Nazi crimes. To dispel such illusions, today we will talk about a terrifying page in the history of the Holocaust. But before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Now, make yourself comfortable. Let's get started. During World War I, about 20 million people were deliberately exterminated, including approximately 7.5 million Soviet citizens. Out of all the war victims, about 6 million were Jews, targeted for destruction solely because of their ethnicity. Remarkably, 2,800,000 of them, almost half, were Soviet citizens. During the war, many knew about the suffering of the Jews. However, some did not believe the reports, others did not grasp the scale, and still others considered the destruction of an entire nation impossible. It was only after the war ended that special terms emerged to describe what had occurred. The most famous is the Americanism Holocaust, derived from the Greek word for burnt offering. Researchers at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum state that from 1933 to 1945, there were 42,500 camps and ghettos across Europe. It was there that prisoners were forced to work under the harshest conditions until they grew too weak, and the weak were killed. The Nazis were fierce anti-Semites. They groundlessly accused German Jews of betrayal during World War I and blamed them for the economic depression in Germany during the 1920s and early 1930s. Anti-Semitism was part of a broader racist ideology aimed at destroying not only Jews but also other undesirable groups, including Roma and homosexuals. The persecution of Jews in the Third Reich began as early as 1933, shortly after the Nazis came to power. At first, they were banned from working in the civil service, and 2 years later, the Nuremberg laws were passed. Jews could no longer marry Aryans and were stripped of their political and various social rights. Subsequently, the pressure intensified. Bans were placed on practicing professions like banking, military officer, and law, as well as the right to educate their children alongside Germans or attend cultural events. From that moment on, Jewish property was subject to mandatory registration. After the Anschluss in March 1938, Adolf Eichmann, an Obersturmführer from the Berlin Gestapo's Jewish Affairs Department, was dispatched to Vienna to tackle a specific task. His agency was meant to speed up the forced immigration of Jews from Germany as much as possible, while squeezing as much money out of the departures as they could. The Central Bureau for Jewish Emigration was set up in the Rothschild Mansion in Vienna, which had been confiscated by the Nazis. By the way, if you want to learn more about another famous dynasty, the Rockefellers, check out this video. Ultimately, by mid-1938, 213,000 Jews had left Germany, and a total of around 400,000 people managed to emigrate before the mass killings began. On November 7th, an event occurred that became the turning point for atrocities against the Jewish people. Herschel Grinspan, a 17-year-old Polish Jew living in Paris, fired 5 shots and seriously wounded Ernst von Rath, a secretary at the German embassy, who died 2 days later. Ironically, the diplomat was already under Gestapo surveillance as a suspected anti-fascist. In response, on the night of November 10th, fascists staged pogroms across Germany and Austria, destroying synagogues and smashing the windows of Jewish-owned shops. This event became known as Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. However, physical extermination was not yet openly discussed. Instead, the regime decided to cover the damages from the pogroms at 25 million marks, including 5 million for the broken storefronts, by confiscating Jewish property. They also forced Jews to wear an identifying mark in the form of a yellow star on their clothes, banned them from studying at public schools and universities, barred them from receiving treatment in public hospitals, and prohibited them from visiting beaches and resorts. In the early 1940s, in the occupied cities of Eastern and Central Europe and the Soviet Union, the Germans herded the Jewish population into specially designated areas. Many of these areas were enclosed by walls, and people lived there in complete isolation from the rest of the world. Inhabitants of other ghettos had the opportunity to go out into the city for work. The Warsaw Ghetto became the most famous, housing 400,000 Jews. This was not only because it was the largest, but also because in the spring of 1943, its prisoners staged an uprising that was brutally suppressed. Historians still debate whether the ghettos were intended from the beginning as transit stations for sending gathered Jews to camps, or if they were meant solely for deportation and isolation. One way or another, starting in 1942, the fascists began mass deportations of ghetto inhabitants to concentration camps for extermination. On January 20, 1942, at the Villa Marlier in Berlin, a conference was held on the final solution to the Jewish question. The technical details for murdering 12 million people, the exact number of Jews the Nazis planned to destroy, were approved, and the death machine roared to life. The first concentration camp was created in Germany back in 1933 for opponents of the Hitler regime. However, the network of death camps took on a colossal scale only after the adoption of the final solution. The methodical and rational organization of murder is what most shocked contemporaries and descendants alike. For instance, the Buchenwald concentration camp began operating in 1937, and 8 years later, it had 66 subcamps and external work detachments. Around 240,000 prisoners passed through it, 56,000 of whom were killed. Furthermore, this camp became infamous due to Ilse Koch, the commandant's wife. According to testimonies from former prisoners, Ilse launched a veritable hunt for people with tattoos inside the camp. Her chosen victims were brought to the camp infirmary under the pretext of a medical examination and killed there with a lethal injection. The commandant's wife banned shooting so as not to ruin the picture with a bullet hole. Pathologists skinned the corpses, and the skin then went into the hands of tanning specialists, who were also prisoners. The wives of SS officers gasped with envy when visiting Ilse's home. She boasted of handmade leather lampshades, book bindings, paintings on the walls, and even a kitchen tablecloth made from the skin of a Paris cabaret singer's back. For her gruesome hobby, prisoners nicknamed her Frau Lampshade. Things were no better in other camps. Prisoners were subjected to forced labor and horrific medical experiments. You can learn more about some of them by watching this video. The difference between a concentration camp and an extermination camp was that the former existed to make prisoners work first, while the latter were created solely for destruction. In death camps, prisoners rarely lived for more than 2 hours, the exact time it took to get from the train station to the gas chamber. As a rule, before deportations from cities or ghettos, people were told they were being taken to family camps for work. This illusion was maintained until the very last moment. People were asked to write postcards to relatives or acquaintances back home and were then sent for disinfection. In concentration camps, this was presented as a shower and treatment with a special solution. Women's hair was cut off. It was later used by private firms to manufacture ropes and textiles. Only then did the victims enter the shower rooms, where they were poisoned with gas, and their corpses were subsequently burned. While Auschwitz and Majdanek used the highly potent Zyklon B gas, Sobibor used carbon monoxide from a diesel engine. In Chelmno, gas vans were utilized. People were loaded into the back of trucks, and on the way to the burial or burning site in the forest, they suffocated as the exhaust fumes were channeled inside the vehicle. Before the murders, prisoners were stripped of their clothes and shoes, and their gold crowns were extracted. Nothing was to go to waste. Even corpses were utilized. Rumors spread that soap was made from human fat. However, the Holocaust Museum later stated that this was merely a rumor spread by the Nazis themselves for intimidation. Yet, far from all Jews even made it to the camps. In the occupied territories of the USSR, special units called Einsatzgruppen followed the advancing army, tasked with eliminating party workers and Jews. Their methods were brutal beyond measure. Men were beaten, women were raped, Jews were tortured and then shot, their bodies dumped into mass graves. Bullets were not wasted on children and infants. They were simply killed with rifle butts or by having their heads smashed against trees. The largest mass shootings took place on September 2930, 1941, on the outskirts of Kiev at a ravine called Babin Yar. Here, around 33,000 Jews were murdered in just a few days. In modern-day Russia, the largest anti-Jewish operation occurred in August 1942 on the outskirts of Rostov-on-Don, in Zmyevskaya Balka, where over 10,000 Jews were slaughtered. Almost until the very end of the war, the liberating nations did not fully grasp the scale and sheer inhumanity of the authors and executioners of the final solution. Upon liberating the concentration camps, military commanders were utterly shattered by what they witnessed, but they kept their promise to punish the guilty. This task was fulfilled by the Nuremberg trials, during which dozens of Nazi war criminals were convicted. You can write in the comments what shocked you most about this horrific history. Also, feel free to suggest topics for our upcoming episodes. Don't forget to like this video, hit the bell icon, and subscribe to our channel.